Now we're ready to turn to a third issue related to inductive certainty. What are the implications of the inductive processes that are so essential to doctrines and systematic theology? There are at least two things to learn from what we have seen. First, we need to narrow the inductive gap. And second, we need to remember the inductive gap. In the first place, it's the responsibility of every believer to work as hard as possible to narrow the inductive gap so that we can have as much certainty as possible in our conclusions. As we work our way through theological discussions in systematic theology, it's often the case that we need to make as strong a case as possible for a point of view. To do this, we need to narrow the distance between our evidence and our conclusions. One way to do this is to collect more biblical evidence that points to the same conclusion. The more evidence there is, the more likely it is that our conclusion is true. For instance, Berkhof's conclusion that Bible saints are constantly represented as confessing their sins in Scripture reflects a large gap because he only cited 9 examples. But had he cited 100 examples, his conclusion would have been much stronger. Had he taken the time to give 1,000 examples, his conclusion would have been even more certain, even though it may have bordered on overkill. Now, finding this many examples may not have been practical, but it would have made his conclusion much more logically certain and compelling. As we involve ourselves with inductive logic in doctrinal discussions, it's always important to ask of ourselves and of others, have enough evidences been brought forward to prove the likelihood of a point of view? Often we'll find that there is need for more inductive evidence to narrow the inductive gap. A second practical implication of what we have seen is this. We must always remember that we cannot utterly escape the inductive gap. As a result, it's often wise simply to acknowledge that certain theological conclusions are less likely or more likely than others. As we've seen in other lessons, it's helpful to think of doctrinal conclusions in terms of a cone of certainty. There are a few beliefs that we hold with great confidence, and these rise to the top of the cone. We have a lesser degree of certainty regarding other beliefs, and so we place these lower in the cone. And finally, there are many beliefs we hold with little certainty, and these occupy the bottom of the cone. As we think about the certainty of our inductive conclusions, it helps to consider them in accordance with this model. Specifically, we can be more confident of some beliefs because the inductive evidence is strong and the inductive gap is relatively small. So these beliefs rise to the top of the cone. These doctrines become settled judgments in our system of belief. But the inductive evidence for other beliefs is not so strong, so that the inductive gap is much more significant, leaving us with less logical certainty about them. As a result, it's very helpful to realize that doctrinal discussions in systematic theology often come down to which view is more likely to be the biblical point of view, which is more comprehensive in its representation of the Bible. For instance, in eschatology, we may be very confident from the teachings of Scripture that Jesus will return in glory. The inductive evidence for this belief is so strong that it should not be doubted. It should be at the top of our cone of certainty. But the evidence is much weaker for particular scenarios that Christians have developed as they discuss when and how Jesus will return. So these conclusions should be much lower in our cone of certainty. We can and should affirm Christ's return with great confidence, but we go far beyond the evidence of induction when we are too dogmatic about many of the specifics of His return. There's nothing wrong with admitting to ourselves and to others that we do not have absolutely conclusive evidence for everything we believe. Often, the challenge we should put forth to ourselves and to others should not be, "This is the only way this doctrine can be understood." Instead, it's often better to say, "This understanding of the doctrine is more likely than others." Then we can fruitfully engage fellow believers by examining the evidence for particular points of view. To sum up, logic is very important in doctrinal discussions that take place in systematic theology. We should employ logic in submission to Scripture as we synthesize biblical teachings. As we discuss theological doctrines, we should also be ready to deduce the implications of Scripture for various issues we're addressing. But in the end, the inductive basis of theological doctrines should remind us that no human formulation of a doctrine is utterly final. There are always ways to improve what we believe.